What really happened with the COVID outbreaks on the first to resume cruises? Was it just that the cruise lines were too quick to chase money versus concerns around public health? Was it that the protocols had some fatal flaws in them? Or was it some clumsy mistakes around implementing the protocols? And what does it mean for cruising now and looking to the months ahead? First of all, let's take a look at what has actually happened as cruises have started up around the world. There's been a number of key outbreaks. The first of those, and the most noticeable of all of those, is on Hurtigruten's expedition ship, the MS Roald Amundsen. This cruise ship has had an outbreak so far of 36 crew members, 33 Filipinos, 1 German, 1 French, and 1 Norwegian. So far, 5 of the passengers have tested positive, but still testing is happening and that number is expected to grow. The second big outbreak with a lot of publicity has happened on Ponant-owned Paul Gauguin ship, where an American passenger, 22-year-old woman, was identified as positive on the ship. All the rest of the crew and passengers have tested negative. Thirdly, we've seen, as cruise lines have taken crew back to man their ships, a number of positive cases arising. So, for example, 10 crew members returning to AIDA in Germany were found and tested positive for COVID-19. And most recently, in the last couple of days, Costa Cruises also talking about 5 of their crew members being tested as positive. However, there's been no reports of incidents on some other cruises that have started up. So, for example, Hurtigruten, with their Norwegian coastal cruises, which head up and down, calling at 34 ports along the coast, they have had no issues at all. Ponant, which sails out of France, has had no issues. We've also seen out of Taiwan, Dream Cruises, which is sailing ships of around 900 passengers, have had no issues. And Mein Schiff, which is sailing these cruises to nowhere out of Germany, have had no reported incidents. So what actually has gone wrong? Let's start by first of all taking a look at the biggest of these, which is the Hurtigruten Roald Amundsen. The Roald Amundsen is one of Hurtigruten's expedition ships. It holds 530 passengers. It set sail on a series of cruises for Norwegian passengers heading up to Svalbard, which is right up in the Arctic Circle. The first cruise went on July the 17th with 209 guests, and the second cruise, the one which was affected, left on the 24th of July from Tromsø, and it had 178 guests on board. There was a number of errors made by Hurtigruten that led to the situation where 36 crew were testing positive, and as I said, at the moment, 5 passengers. What went wrong? What were the errors that happened? Well, first of all, the key error that they seem to have made is around quarantining the staff. When crew came back to join the ship, they had to have a COVID-19 test before they left their home country. Under the Norway regulations, once they joined, they had to go into quarantine before having another test. Hurtigruten approach to quarantining was not as the health authorities had understood it. So the crew were quarantined on the ship, but they were still fulfilling their normal duties. Hurtigruten took quarantine to mean not heading out onto land. So the crew weren't actually locked away. This is very different to what happened with Costa and AIDA with their crew. What they did is the same thing. The crew had a test before they left their home country. They then went into a very strict quarantine on the ships, where they were basically confined to their cabin before having the second test. It was the second test that threw up the issues. Hurtigruten had a different approach to quarantining, which was not really, it appears, within the rules and regulations. The second key mistake they appear to have made, which may have contributed to what happened, is one of the guests on that first cruise to Svalbard, when they went home, actually tested positive for COVID-19. However, what happened next is the subject of some confusion, because it was never announced that he had actually been on the cruise, because Hurtigruten, according to Norwegian press reports, had argued there was no proof that he'd caught it on the ship. So certainly in terms of notifying people, notifying passengers on the next cruise that someone had tested positive, this doesn't appear to have been followed through. Of course, we don't know if this particular passenger was the cause of what happened next. The third key mistake they made, which seems quite a significant one, is during the course of that second cruise, 4 of the crew members fell ill, not showing classic COVID-19 symptoms, but certainly ill enough that they were quarantined. However, the Norwegian authorities don't seem to have been alerted. The passengers weren't alerted. The passengers weren't quarantined. Once they got back to Tromsø, the passengers were allowed to disembark and head off home. Those 4 crew members were taken to the hospital, tested, as I guess is standard practice now for COVID-19. All 4 tested positive. As a result of that, all 158 crew were tested and 36 of them were found to be positive. None of those 36, including the original 4, showing any of the classic signs of COVID-19. As we know happens quite a lot, they were asymptomatic and not showing signs. By now, the passengers had headed back to their homes in Norway. There was still a group of those that were still in Tromsø. They were then quarantined in a hotel. Testing had started. At the time of recording, only 24 of those had been tested and 5 of those had been found positive. What the Norwegian authorities are saying is they believe that, of course, as they track and trace the rest of the passengers, they will have more positive cases. So certainly, as you can see, a number of key mistakes, certainly around notifying people, but also very importantly is when they had crew members falling ill, there wasn't a lockdown on the ship. There was an assumption made that it could be COVID-19, and people still carried on their cruise, carried on with their activities, and were allowed to disembark. Some other key issues related to the protocol is 2 things that should be noted, one of which is passengers joining the Hurtigruten cruises did not have to have any form of COVID-19 tests either before or during, and it doesn't appear to be any testing facilities on board the ship. So crew were tested, but passengers weren't. And secondly, one of the notable differences in the Hurtigruten protocols, although they do have the things like social distancing, no self-service dining, and limits on the amount of people in any venues at any point in time, hand washing. They don't have masks as part of their protocol, unlike, say, Costa Cruises or Crystal and some of the other cruise lines, as they look to start up where mask wearing is a bigger part of the protocols. This wasn't and doesn't seem to be the case on Hurtigruten. So definitely, as we look at Hurtigruten, there does seem to be a number of issues related to the way the protocols were implemented, which has now been admitted and confirmed by the CEO of Hurtigruten. And certainly that does seem to be a fundamental part of the breakdown, is how the protocols were actually implemented. So let's take a look what happened with Paul Gauguin, because this is a slightly different situation where the protocols do seem to have been clicked into place and have worked in this particular circumstance. Unlike Hurtigruten, if you go on a Paul Gauguin cruise, testing for passengers as well as crew is part of the process. So before you fly into French Polynesia, you have to show proof of a negative COVID-19 test within the past 72 hours. Once you enter the country, you do have to have a second test as part of the whole protocol. So actually on board Paul Gauguin, because passengers have been there for less than 5 days, they had some of the passengers being tested on board. This is where the passenger was identified, a 22-year-old American. Once she was tested positive, immediately the ship went into lockdown. So all the passengers had to go to their cabins and everyone was isolated. The ship immediately turned around, unlike Hurtigruten, which carried on with the cruise. The ship immediately turned around and headed back to Papeti. Once it got there, the infected passenger was removed, sent to the hospital, tested. Everyone was isolated. Everybody on board the ship was tested, crew and passengers. Everyone tested negative. However, the passengers are they're slowly being disembarked, held in some sort of quarantine for 5 days and tested again. So here you can see there was quite a strict sense of protocol and very fast reaction and notification involvement of the authorities. So although there's been lots of press about the Paul Gauguin incident, there was one passenger who tested negative when leaving the USA, but as testing positive, again, asymptomatic. As I've already mentioned, what we've seen with the other cruise lines that have been testing crew, that whole process of pre-testing before they leave the country, holding them in quarantine to that critical 5 days or so, and doing a second test has picked up those issues. So what is the effect of these outbreaks on these first to return to cruising cruises? There are 3 really big things that are happening and will happen as we look at cruising. First of all, the resumption of cruising is going to slow down significantly. The brakes are going to be put on and it is going to be extended. We're already seeing that. So for example, in Norway, they have an immediate ban for initially a couple of weeks on all cruise ships of over 100 passengers in their waters. Secondly, what we've seen is Italy, which is where AIDA ships are actually flagged, have refused AIDA the permission to start sailing, even though they were planning to sail out of Germany. They are quoting sort of public health concerns, so they haven't let AIDA start cruising, unlike, say, Mein Schiff or Hapag-Lloyd, which aren't flagged in Italy and have been allowed to start sailing in Germany. So we've certainly seen some immediate stops on cruising and I think we'll see more and more of those cancellations. One of the areas to watch is Greece. Just in the last week or so that this all happened, had given permission for cruises to start in Greece, and it'll be interesting to see whether they shift and change that advice. So that's definitely one to watch. Secondly, we undoubtedly will see a review of the protocols in terms of what worked and what didn't work, and particularly when we see what worked for Paul Gauguin and didn't work for Hurtigruten. All the cruise lines at the moment have focused very much their protocols on things that are likely to catch people with symptoms or to stop the spread of symptoms. So they have things like temperature checking, lots of focus on sanitization, social distancing, controlling the number of people in venues, cruises nowhere or limited ports. But what they haven't really built in is two fundamental things. First of all, how do they deal and capture asymptomatic passengers? As we've seen with Paul Gauguin, they have a process of testing with the 2 tests before you arrive, after a number of days, once you've arrived, which of course doesn't happen for cruises like the Hurtigruten or the Mein Schiffs. So I think the whole asymptomatic passenger protocol will be reviewed. And of course, again, I think the issue of masks, as we've seen on land, the use of masks has become more and more part of the daily protocol, and certainly cruise lines are starting to incorporate the mask usage much more. So I think we will see much more around those 2 topics. The third area that I think we will see a huge amount of focus is what went wrong with the Hurtigruten issue, which is the implementation of protocols when there is an outbreak. As we saw, although it wasn't great for the Paul Gauguin cruise passengers who were then isolated and had their cruise cut short when one person was caught positive, but there was a very clear, tight and very strict protocol which was followed and put in place to minimize and reduce the impact. So I think we're going to see an enormous amount of pressure on the actual protocols with an outbreak. And certainly if you look at the CDC documentation and you look at their current consultation paper that they have out there, there is an enormous amount of emphasis they put on what happens if there is an outbreak and how do you minimize the strain on the public health system. And certainly one of the criticisms that the Norway health authorities have had is because of the way that Hurtigruten managed it, where they let passengers head back out right across Norway, they have created an enormous problem in terms of track and trace. That's what actually happened with these outbreaks. There's been a lot of hype, a lot of myths, and a lot of misinformation out there. But as we can see, there is a combination of protocols needing to be tightened up, some of the protocols perhaps not capturing every issue. Secondly, we've seen that the way that you implement and follow protocols is really, really fundamental to this whole process, and that didn't happen in every single case. And of course, the third big question overall, which I think is fundamental to the extension of cruising, is as we've seen on land, the virus is still pretty rampant. It can flare up really quickly. We're seeing local lockdowns all around the world, concerns about a second wave. And actually the challenges of actually heading off on any kind of travel with the virus and its current state looks very challenging, which is why I do think even these early cruises have shown it's probably going to be a time that the cruise lines and authorities are going to have to extend cruising much more. What do you think about the whole learnings from this startup of cruising? Leave your thoughts and comments. Love to hear what you think.